5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Order. Order. Well, good morning, colleagues, and welcome to this earlier than normal session, but we know that the Paymaster has cabinet duties later this morning, so Nick, we're very grateful that you could find the time to see us today. Just for the record, if I could just ask you to briefly introduce your team, and then we will turn straight into questions.
So, obviously, Nick Thomas-Symonds, and I am the Paymaster General, and then Darren.
Darren Tierney, Director General for Propriety and the Constitution Group in the Cabinet Office.
And Hermione.
Hermione Gough, I'm Director of the EU Relations Secretariat in the Cabinet Office.
Thank you. Well, you're all welcome. Paymaster General, I wonder, could you set out what you think your strategic approach is looking to drive forward a EU-UK reset?
Well, thank you, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to come and discuss these matters before the committee. With regard to the UK-EU reset, broadly speaking, I think it exists in what I refer as three pillars, three different areas. I think the first is around security. It focuses on foreign policy and defence issues. There's already been some progress on this, given that the former EU High Representative and the Foreign Secretary have agreed already 6 monthly foreign policy dialogues, and that's a very important coordination function that exists, and we will look to deepen that still further. The second pillar is around the safety of citizens. So what we are talking about there is deeper law enforcement cooperation, and that obviously applies across a range of serious and organised crime that crosses across borders that, quite frankly, no single country can deal with on its own. And we're talking about fraud, money laundering, counter-terrorism, people smuggling, all these crimes that are often perpetrated by criminal gangs and are, in the case of people smuggling, for example, perpetrated across thousands of miles, where that coordinated action is hugely important. The government has already increased its National Crime Agency presence at Europol, and it is that closer relationship with Europol which is one of the really important aspects of the safety pillar of the reset going forward. The third pillar is then on trade and pragmatically reducing trade barriers where we can. The manifesto that we were elected on sets out the framework for that. It sets out that we will not return to the single market or customs union or freedom of movement. But it also sets out examples of things that would have that pragmatic effect of reducing trade barriers. So, for example, a sanitary and phytosanitary agreement with the European Union in things like agricultural products, agri-food products. Also in respect of services and mutual recognition of professional qualifications. We have an over 80% services economy. It's one of our great strengths, and I think the more that those who provide services, very talented people across our country, are able to do that across the European Union, that can only be to our economic benefit. Also, the cultural sector, there is an issue with our touring artists in terms of the rules that currently exist, and we want to make it easier for our touring artists to be able to perform around the EU. And then finally, in terms of energy, it's already the case in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, it's in Article 392, that the EU and the UK should consider the relationship between their emissions trading schemes. But it is also about energy security more generally, which has been brought into sharp focus by Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and the impact that had on international energy prices. So, Chair, it would be broadly speaking in those three areas that we want to push forward.
Okay, thank you. Could I just ask you, there may have been oversights, but just to clarify, where you talked about the intensification of cooperation on sort of security and combating crime matters. In the list that you set out, which was quite a full list, is it envisaged that a sort of more European coordination on illegal migration is part of those discussions as well. I know you talked about people smuggling,
yes,
etc., but those can be, well, they often are two entirely separate things.
Yeah, so I do think this is an area where increased coordination is going to be hugely important. We have already, Chair, announced our border security commander, and it's Martin Hewitt, very public servant with very distinguished record. In a previous life as when I was shadowing the Home Affairs Department, I saw the work that he was doing. He is now in that role. Part of obviously the Border Security Command is partly about coordination of our agencies, so whether that is police, whether that is in terms of Border Force, whether that's in terms of Crown Prosecution Service International, and then reporting directly to the Home Secretary. But clearly, an important aspect of that is also coordination across Europe. People do not become refugees in northern France. They have often come on journeys of thousands of miles. So disrupting across those routes does require that deeper cooperation. For example, how quickly we are able to share data with Europol is a real issue.
It's on the agenda.
Yes, is the answer.
A number of organisations and people will welcome your comments with regards to travelling artists and the complications there. Some eyebrows have been raised at what's perceived to be the government's unwillingness or whatever to consider for young people Erasmus and any form of small-L liberalisation of travel arrangements and so on and so forth. Is the government fluid on that, or is it fixed?
So to your first point around the touring artists, we have an issue at the moment which is around.
No, I know that's welcome. I think we all know what the issue is, but I just wanted to drill down into the wider youth.
Yeah, that is obviously a mobility issue as well, because of the limits of only having so many days within 180 days within the Schengen system. So that is a mobility.
And you have to provide all this valuation document if you're taking your cello to Prague or something.
Yeah, precisely. And
not that I ever take cellos to Prague. I just want to
take what you wish to Prague. But in terms of the wider youth mobility point. What we've always said about that is that if you look at our manifesto, it's not part of our plans or examples in the manifesto. The red lines that we have are around single market, customs union and freedom of movement. We're going to stick to those red lines. That is our position in the negotiation. What obviously will now happen as we move towards the EU-UK summit on the 19th of May. It's a matter for the EU what it wishes to prioritise, but that's our position in terms of our priorities.
More a question, I suppose, for Treasury, but the removal of the winter fuel allowance and the family farms tax was not in your manifesto either. So it's interesting that the government now feels that it's hog-tied to its manifesto in some respects. But let me just
without though, Chair, and I know we're straying away from strictly what I'm giving evidence on, but I'm sure committee members would also recognise the scale of the economic situation that we inherited and very difficult decisions that had to be taken as a consequence.
Yes, well, we won't push that to a division, Paymaster. Let me ask you two further questions on the European issue. We are a third country, close third country, with a lot of history between us. How do you assess the appetite within the corridors of power of the Commission and the wider EU for that strategic reset of which you speak?
I think there's been a very positive response. There's been, as you can imagine, Chair, a significant amount of engagement. The Prime Minister to the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen. Prime Minister's also met the European Parliament President, Roberta Metsola, has met both Council Presidents, because obviously it was Charles Michel first of all, it's been Antonio Costa, so met both of those as well. I've met Maroš Šefčovič, who is my interlocutor on a number of occasions. And I think at this time there is goodwill, real goodwill on both sides. I think there is a recognition that we are now in the mid-2020s. We share significant challenges and opportunities with the European Union. I think there is a real desire to look forward, not back, that I find in the corridors of the Commission, but also with the new government here in the United Kingdom. So I do think there is a real opportunity now to work on shared priorities together.
The Prime Minister has, with some legitimacy, I think resurrected Lord Palmerston's dictum that Britain really has no friends, only interests, and wants to be friendly with both the United States and the European Union. You'll have seen in media this morning with regards to tariffs on steel, with Britain sort of straddle, or the UK seeking to sort of straddle the issue, really. If push comes to shove, with whom does the government instinctively hop into bed? Is it America or is it the EU? Because at some point, President Trump appears to be wanting to drive the wedge. Do we play along with that?
Well, certainly to begin, Chair, as you did with Lord Palmerston, certainly our interests are eternal and perpetual, as Palmerston once did say. And that is certainly what drives this government. It's our national interest. And as the Prime Minister made clear only a few weeks ago, we do not accept that that means choosing between allies. And in respect of the European Union, we think there are significant opportunities to deepen trade. We also think there are significant opportunities to deepen trade and to make the special relationship with the United States even more special and to deepen it into the 21st century. We do not see, in any sense, a conflict between those two things. In fact, we think it's in our national interest to work more closely with both the EU and the United States.
I think that's readily understood and grateful for the clarification. But if push comes to shove and the Commission turns around and says, you want a reset, you want liberalisation, you want less friction, etc., the price that you have to pay for that is that you have to declare for the EU in this issue against the United States, not enjoy exemptions from US-imposed tariffs on Europe. Where does the government jump?
Well, that hasn't arisen. I can say.
No, but I'm saying,
I, in terms of, there may well be various hypotheticals across the course of the Parliament in terms of international events that, sitting here, none of us can foresee as of today. But the government's firm position is that we do not choose between allies. We share deep values with both the European Union and indeed the United States. And our firm policy is that we will continue to deepen relationships with both.
We're happy to cut Solomon like the baby in two.
I think it's perfectly possible to cuddle more than one person at the same time.
I'm sure Mrs. Thomas-Symonds will be delighted to hear that. And I challenge any other select committee to have both Palmerston and Solomon referenced in the same question. Luke Taylor.
How do I follow that? Thank you very much for the very comprehensive opening answer, which has kind of answered a number of my initial points and the points I was going to explore. But you spoke clearly about the red lines, and you spoke about the manifesto commitments that you made. I think what a lot of people are quite concerned about is that we see circumstances changing very quickly. You mentioned hypotheticals, but as the Chair has mentioned, this morning we have suddenly tariffs being discussed on steel with the US, and so we don't really need to talk about potential hypotheticals. We've got these circumstances directly in front of us. I just want to press on the economic impacts, so the third pillar, first of all. So we've talked, obviously we prioritise growth and the government has prioritised finding growth wherever it can. but what assessment have you made on the economic impact of those red lines that you've already drawn and the commitments that were made in a manifesto a year ago now, almost, with very different circumstances, very different world picture in mind? What's the impact that those red lines are going to put on us and our ability to trade with the EU, for example?
Well, in terms, first of all, of the economic impact of arrangements we may reach with the European Union, we obviously have the first EU-UK summit, which will be on the 19th of May, and obviously any agreement that we reach on different pillars, different parts of the pillars, of course there'll be, I'm sure, not just the government, but I'm sure there'll be numerous independent economic assessments of where we get to. Now, specifically in relation to the red lines, what the economic impact of these things is depends on what happens over time. It depends. The previous government, for example, signed free trade agreements with both New Zealand and with Australia, and also acceded to the CPTPP. We shall have to see how that develops. But our position on this is that we will continue to seek deeper trading links. We want to increase our exports. I gave evidence before the DBT Select Committee with Minister Alexander about this only a few weeks ago. So we will continue to deepen trading links. As in my answer to the chair, I said, we don't accept this binary choice of having to choose between allies. We will continue to deepen trading links. And I think in terms of the economic impact of our policy on the reset, I've no doubt there'll be significant analysis of it when we get to the summit.
So, you talk about seeing the change and dealing with circumstances as they arise, yet they will always be constrained by these red lines if you are committing to stick to those. And the specific question was about the economic impact. Has that been quantified on the impact of those red lines written a year ago with different circumstances in mind?
Well, there's a load of previous, I don't want to relive the 2017 to 19 Parliament, but there's analysis that was that was done in that period. But ultimately, what the economic impact is depends upon events across the course of this Parliament. And I'm sure that we will be judged on that as by everything else. But what we are seeking to do here is to absolutely have a new partnership with the European Union, but we are doing so, I would argue, with a strong democratic mandate to do it from July of last year. We are doing it on the basis that's in that manifesto, and with examples in the manifesto of what we are seeking to negotiate. But to your question about, of course, the government's going to have to be agile in its foreign policy. I don't think there's any question about that as events develop. But at the same time, I do think, to your point, the democratic point is crucial as well in terms of how we've been elected and the basis upon which we've been elected.
Just going on to how the reset is being conducted across different policy areas, obviously your role is to bring that into a single point so you can see within the various pillars, although hopefully they're or the silos, hopefully they're working fairly in an integrated way. So how are you working between those departments and how are you overseeing that and coordinating between those various groups?
So, first of all, we established through a machinery of government change the European Union Relations Secretariat in the Cabinet Office, and that was done last summer. So that brings together officials formerly in the Foreign Office, together with the Windsor Framework Task Force, together with a very small number of officials from the National Security Secretariat. So they're based, with me in the Cabinet Office. That then becomes the coordinating, central responsibility in government for our relationship with the European Union and for the work we need to do now on the EU-UK reset. The bilateral relationships between the UK and European countries remains with the Foreign Office, and we'll work very closely with both the Foreign Secretary and indeed the Europe Minister, Stephen Doughty, in terms of those bilateral relationships. Obviously, then, if you look at the various, the pillars that I've identified, the coordinating responsibility then becomes extremely important, because take, for example, the issue of irregular migration, which I was discussing with the Chair in the opening. Clearly, the Home Office leads in respect of that, but work very closely with the Home Office. On something like a sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, that would obviously be DEFRA in the detail, but again, the coordinating function, the negotiating function, dare I even say it, ultimate trade-off decisions obviously belong in the Cabinet Office with me. And in terms of the relationship with the Commission, which is the negotiating body for the European Union, the negotiator for the Commission is Maroš Šefčovič, and obviously on the UK side it's me. So it's that direct relationship that is important now going forward.
So it's the coordination between the Foreign Office and the practical steps and the decisions on those trade-offs that sits on in your lap, I suppose it appears.
Many things on my lap, as we'll discover, I think, in the course of the committee. But it's not only the Foreign Office, it's not only the Home Office. Obviously, work very closely with Northern Ireland Secretary as well in terms of the Windsor framework. So, something like, for example, the issue of Tory artists would be DCMS. So it's not only the Foreign Office. This is very domestic facing as well. So it's a number of government departments we work and coordinate very closely with.
So on the touring musicians, for example, when the calls are made for a scheme to simplify that, I know a colleague of ours has put in a 10-minute rule bill on that, to simplify the rules around that. That comes to the Foreign Office. Then where would that go to? And then you sit there and you look at the trade-offs around.
No, that's my direct responsibility in terms of the negotiation. Obviously, as you can imagine, I work very closely with DCMS in terms of how exactly we would deliver that. But delivering that is within my responsibility as the negotiator.
Good to know.
Thank you.
John, you mentioned during the briefing you might want to ask about the devolved administrations. At this point.
I'll come to
okay, fine. And I'll steam on to the final point now. So this is about engaging with Parliament. How is that going to be managed? How are we going to be informed on the progress? How are we going to be informed on how the negotiations are going and ultimately the trade-offs that you're making? When are we going to get the chance to celebrate or decry the decisions that have been made rather than through the press or social media?
I have no doubt there'll be a range of reactions, but this is a really important point, and accountability to Parliament is very important for the government. It's very important for me. I think actually this is the fourth committee I've appeared before in the space of 7 months, so I don't think anyone could say I haven't been offering myself for scrutiny. So I've appeared before the House of Lords Europe Committee, I've appeared before the House of Lords Constitutional Committee, I've appeared before the Business and Trade Committee, and I've appeared here. And not that I'm suggesting it's the fourth most important, of course, Chair. I would put it
I'm sure
at a very high level.
You were saving the best till last.
Absolutely. And I'm sure there will be a few more of these select committee appearances, so I'm perfectly happy to do that and to be held to account. Obviously, there are departmental questions, Cabinet Office questions. I am committed to regularly updating Parliament. I gave a statement to Parliament, for example, last Thursday because last week we had the Prime Minister attending the European Council dinner on the Monday. I spoke at the EU-UK forum on the Tuesday and then had a meeting with Maroš Šefčovič on the Wednesday. And of course, my priority was to give a statement to Parliament on that on the Thursday. So I will, of course, continue being held to account in that way.
I think I'd echo colleagues and encourage you to continue to make statements as regularly as possible rather than needing to be urgent questioned into the chamber, because that is it's a much more constructive way to be having that discussion.
I entirely agree, and I'm very much prefer the proactive statement.
Before I bring in John, Lauren, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, if I may, just on the economic growth priority that you've mentioned. There have been reports in the press that some ministers consider services is going to be one of the most difficult areas of negotiation, but I'm obviously very conscious that that's one of our huge strengths. I think 80% of Britain's economy is based on services. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about those trade-offs between, I guess, things that might be not easy, but maybe a little bit less challenging, versus those things like services where they might be more challenging, but they would certainly bring perhaps more bang for buck in terms of economic growth?
Well, at this stage, obviously, we've not gone into what I call the steep phase of the negotiation before the summit on Monday, the 19th of May. And, having in a previous life conducted many negotiations, you don't tend to sort of really ultimately see what the trade-offs are until a very late stage, frankly, because I'm talking generally here, parties in a negotiation may well have a series of objectives, but ultimately when it comes to the crunch, what exactly the order of priority is, you don't often see in the other side until a very late stage. So in terms of what we think may be more difficult or not is not clear at this stage. I mean, in terms of your point about services, obviously that's a hugely important part of our economy. You're entirely right. We're an over 80% services economy. I get lots of advice from different newspapers as to what is easy and what is not. But I guess ultimately the proof for that will be in the action over the next few months. But services are certainly a priority for us, and mutual recognition agreements are important in terms of greater flexibility and openness for us, where we have very talented people delivering services across the United Kingdom, and obviously being able to do that more easily across borders is helpful.
One more from me, just briefly. Obviously, financial services is hugely important to economic growth as well. Can you talk a bit more about, I appreciate you might not necessarily be able to outline what you're looking to see in terms of a negotiated agreement, but maybe what discussions you've been having with city figures, what industry wants to see from the EU-UK reset?
Well, in terms of this, obviously the city minister in the Treasury obviously has the direct relationship with the city, as you would expect, but in terms of the various business groups, from Business Europe to, for example, the CBI, certainly are on a regular basis. That it's not somehow confidential to government or anything like that. They're publishing quite regularly the kind of things that they would like to see. But fundamentally, in the services sector, and we have very particular strengths in financial services. We have very particular strengths in my former profession in legal services, etc. What we are always looking to do is to advance our interests in those areas. There are various practical proposals that have been made, but ultimately that is going to come down to the negotiation. But as I say, it's easing of trade, playing on our strengths here in the UK that's important.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, Minister. I want to ask you more about the summit in May. What are your ambitions for that summit and the outputs that you hope to achieve?
So, when we first were discussing this matter, I was in Brussels with President von der Leyen and indeed the Prime Minister. Maros Sefcovic and I were both there, and both the Prime Minister and President von der Leyen, to each of their negotiators, said, look, it's time to explore now what are the deliverables, what can we deliver in terms of the summit. Now, in terms of your direct question, obviously what we will do over the next couple of months that we have is to try to progress on all three of our pillars. Now, it may be that some we can progress more quickly than others, and we will be able to see that, I think, over the course of the next few months. This is the start of a series of summits. This is the first one. This is obviously important and symbolic, I appreciate, because it is the first one. We will obviously want to progress on the three pillars. How far we can progress will obviously depend upon the next few weeks. But for me, it is about the importance of the examples that are in our manifesto, how quickly we can, A, negotiate them and secondly deliver them, because those two things are different in terms of both being able to negotiate something in principle but then implement it. But what I'm doing in terms of, if you like, the tests I set myself in negotiation is looking for progress across all three of the pillars.
You speak about the three pillars, but I don't think you've published a detailed strategy or policy paper on this. It's quite hard for Parliament to measure whether the summit in May is successful or not, isn't it? I
don't agree, because what we have is a manifesto that sets out clearly examples of what we want to do. Parliament will be able to hold us to account on the manifesto, will be able to hold us to account on the promises we made about the structure of the negotiation. And that document obviously has the endorsement, the strength, if you like, of having delivered the majority that it did last July. So I think Parliament is more than capable of holding us to account on that.
At the time of the last government's agreement of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, I think you were quoted as saying there was holes that needed to be fixed. Can you give us a bit more detail about those holes and whether they might be some of the outputs that you might be hoping to achieve as part of the summit?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of examples here. There is the whole issue of foreign policy and defence cooperation, just as an example. Now, when we were an EU member state, you would obviously have found at the various meetings, committees and structures that existed that both politicians and indeed officials would have had that regular structured cooperation. The TCA does have certain areas of structure, of course. For example, the Parliamentary Partnership Assembly is a really important body. So there are, of course, different structures that have been set up, but that is an obvious example of where having that structure in place would fill a gap. So just on the safety pillar, the speed with which you can share information is something that's another gap we can deal with. So, and that is because there's a distinction between take the Europol example, sharing data in real time versus requesting data and it later being provided. And when you're dealing with serious and organised crime, those moments in those early stages of criminal detection really matter. And then the obvious places on the trade pillar that there is a gap in terms of agricultural products and agri-food products that obviously the SPS is trying to deal with. There's that, the gap in services again. There's the gap in culture. There's also, on energy, although there is an energy chapter within the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, Article 392, actually commits both parties to future talks. So rather than, I guess, on that, it's identifying an issue and then encouraging the parties to later have talks to seek and resolve it. So I think there are a number of areas there that I would suggest, deal with some of the holes I previously identified.
So although the UK government's not published a sort of detailed policy or strategy paper, the EU have drawn up a list of aspirations from this process, which I'm sure you have seen, given it's been quite widely leaked. Do you have any views on the contents of that document?
In terms of the EU's position, there have been various documents at different times over the last 7 months and beyond that have been leaked, but it's for the EU will now, and I respect the EU to carry out its own internal processes to get to its own final negotiating positions. It will now be doing work and has been doing work with its member states. So I don't think it'd be appropriate for me to comment on some earlier documents which are part of a process that is yet to reach its completion. And I think it's I respect whoever the negotiating partner is to come forward with their priorities. That's a matter for them.
And then lastly from me, just in terms of the devolution settlement, obviously as a Scottish MP I've got a keen interest in this, and lots of these policy areas are in the devolved policy space. What discussions have you had with the Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament about these potential changes that you're seeking to make, and what sort of consenting role will they have to whatever agreement the UK Government makes with the EU?
I share your passion as a Welsh member of Parliament, and the devolved administrations are a real priority. So couple of points here. Firstly, I chair the interministerial group, and it's really important that I keep them updated. So that will consist of representatives from the Northern Irish Government, Scottish Government, and indeed the Welsh Government. I can't remember off the top of my head, Chair, but early December, November was, I think, the last, that I chaired formally. Secondly, when I was in Brussels last week, I made sure that I met representatives, officials from each of the devolved administrations. I will continue to facilitate the involvement of the devolved administrations in the process. I think it's hugely important. I think it's important, firstly, in terms of respect for the devolution settlement, but secondly, important because we want the reset to be of benefit to the whole of the United Kingdom. I would also just say a specific word in relation to Northern Ireland, because I also have the Windsor Framework Task Force within the Cabinet Office as part of the European Union Relations Secretariat. I work very closely with the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland in respect of the Windsor Framework. And, Chair, as I'm sure you'll recall, when it was negotiated by the previous government, we supported it in opposition. I think that cross-party support was really important in terms of the Windsor Framework. And we will I will continue to work very closely with the Northern Ireland Secretary on that as well. So the whole of the UK, in summary for you, the whole of the United Kingdom and the position of the devolved administrations is very important.
But just to force the point on consent, as you'll have to say, the politics in Scotland is somewhat different from the rest of the UK with an SNP administration. If they decide to be awkward and say they do not like something which you have agreed to as part of this reset, do they have any ability to stop it happening or to withhold consent?
Well, obviously, foreign policy matters are not devolved. I mean, that is just our constitutional arrangement. In respect of whether it's, and I appreciate your point that each of the devolved administrations has its own unique circumstances. But what I am seeking to do is to try to keep devolved governments informed throughout the process. I'm keen to have detailed discussions in particular areas, and indeed I've made that offer to the devolved administrations. Whether ultimately a devolved administration for political or other reasons wish to criticise part of what's negotiated, that's a matter for them. That's politics. We have devolved elections coming up next year. But what I will undertake to do through the course of the process is to work closely with the devolved administrations, and that's precisely what I've already been doing since last July.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Charlotte.
Good morning, Minister. You've largely answered my first question, which was about what the EU's formal position was going to be. In other words, we don't know yet. But we have heard various linkages that have been coming out, for example, on fisheries and youth mobility. So how are you working to calibrate our negotiating position in the light of the likely things that will be in the EU's position?
I think what we are seeking to do here is firstly to put our national interest is obviously paramount in any foreign policy, as the point I made to the Chair at the outset. But I also think we have to move away from this as the idea of some sort of zero-sum game. The idea that there's one part that benefits the UK, one part benefits the EU, because there are so many parts of this that are actually of mutual benefit. And this is I made this point. I've made this point several times, and I made it in a speech I made at the EU-UK Forum last week. And if you look across the three pillars, it is clearly of mutual interest to coordinate on foreign policy and security matters. In the safety pillar, if we are together to tackle serious and organised crime, that's a benefit to citizens right across the European Union. And on trade, where we are seeking to reduce trade barriers, that is helpful for imports and indeed for exports. So what I'm seeking to do is to make that point loud and clear, because I think for too long we've had this sense that somehow one party wins here, another party wins here. So much is a mutual benefit. And I think that's the sort of mindset that I take into negotiations.
And I'm agree with that, who wouldn't? But the EU has a structure, it has shared ideas, freedom of movement across the EU and things like that. So it will have its red lines, just as we have our red lines. And how are you trying to plan our negotiations so that you know how you're going to respond to their red lines?
So I'm pragmatic. I am looking at what is negotiable and deliverable, and I think that is really important. Of course, the EU has its institutional structures, it has its single market freedoms, it has its processes that we will see over the next few weeks in terms of how it develops its negotiating positions as agreed with the member states. I'm loath to get into very particular scenarios because I think what will happen is you will see not just objectives but what is in reality the hierarchy of those objectives from the European Union. But what I do think is that the United Kingdom has its framework, its red lines, if you like, as I've set out. The European Union has its structures which we respect. But I do think, and again I answered this in my earlier statement, there is a real goodwill to find pragmatic solutions that are of benefit to people here in the UK and of benefit to people in the EU as well.
And in that, how are you working with the various departments who will be impacted? So your government's major priority is growth. So obviously business and trade is going to have a big interest in these negotiations. But let's say it's the youth mobility scheme. So then how will you be working with the Department of Trade and the Home Office and other departments to balance out where we can give a bit?
So in terms of the coordinating structure, the Cabinet has a Europe committee, and whilst chair it is of course well established, one does not comment on the duration, length or content of the committees. That it exists is a matter of public record. That is the coordinating function that exists. So in respect of different issues that may arise in the course of the negotiation, what will happen is that the relevant Secretary of State would have the opportunity as part of our collective decision making to make the case as they see fit. But it is obviously me as the negotiator who has to go and negotiate with Brussels.
Okay, thank you.
Very briefly.
Very briefly, because I want to...
and it was helpful you brought up the zero-sum game point about how negotiations with our European neighbours are not a zero-sum game and everybody benefits. I just worry that when we look at across the Atlantic, we have a president who sees everything as a zero-sum game where somebody has to win and somebody has to lose. And whilst at the very beginning we talked about how we look between the two, how do you marry up and how do you correlate those two approaches that we're likely to see, particularly when you have red lines that apply to negotiations with one, and as far as I recall from the Labour manifesto, I don't remember many red lines in negotiating with another incredibly major trading partner, which is North America. Are we at risk of having to bend and break with a partner who will not necessarily negotiate with everybody's growth in mind, but be constrained by red lines with another?
No, look, whoever is the American president, I'd expect them to be guided by their own national interest. They may all have, individual styles, and of course they have in the past. But I don't think it's any surprise that any American president would pursue vigorously the United States' national interest. We, as the UK government, put our national interest first. However, to the first part of your question, there are so many things in our national interest that are in the interest of another number of other countries as well. I think, just to take the safety pillar, for example, coordination across the world's democracies to tackle crime is evidently in all of our interests. And I think, for me, it's for other countries to pursue their foreign policy, pursue their interests. But I will continue to make the case that on a number of these issues, agreements we can make benefit both parties, and in some cases more than one party. I would argue, for example, when we're talking about something like irregular migration, I mean, that benefits member states across the European Union if we're tackling those criminal smuggler gangs together.
Thank you. Richard Baker.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Minister. Can I ask how you'd describe the overall state of the government's preparations in advance of formal negotiations? For example, would you be ready to start formal negotiations in areas such as sanitary and phytosanitary checks you mentioned earlier, or emissions trading, if the EU are ready to pursue those negotiations now?
Look, I think we are in a positive space in terms of preparation. I think that we've obviously been in office since last July, but what I would also say is there has been a real building of personal relationships. Now, you're absolutely right. We can, I could answer the question in terms of preparedness across Whitehall, and that is obviously very important. It's hugely important that work is going on. Take, for example, on a sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, that there is work going on in DEFRA in preparation for that. But the building of personal relationships is hugely important as well. And there's been, I think, just over 70 ministerial engagements, visits at a number of different levels in government. You'll have seen, for example, the Chancellor, I was just checking the date in my papers, was at the Eurogroup on the 9th of December. The Foreign Secretary was at the Foreign Affairs Council on the 14th of October. I've spoken to Maroš Šefčovič, number of occasions. The Prime Minister has spoken, I think, either in person or by telephone 5 times to the Commission President. So we have been doing that work in terms of building those relationships which are important in foreign policy. So I do think we are in a positive space, and we were able, I think the evidence of that is that last week in Brussels, what came out of that was the summit date, and I think both parties were agreed on that summit date on the 19th of May, and I think it's an indication of our level of preparedness that we're in a position now to actually put a date to that.
Thank you, Minister. And of course, the benefits of developing those positive personal relationships that are shown in achieving the announcement of the summit date, and I completely appreciate that. But obviously, detailed proposals and the structure of those and the outcomes we're seeking will also be important as well. You mentioned that there might be some areas where we're able to move faster. For example, you discussed touring artists earlier on. In an area like that, would be closer to being in a position to set out a detailed proposal to our European partners and a roadmap to getting to the position we'd like to see. Is that an area where we'd be ready to move quite quickly, for example?
Well, I think that depends on the negotiating partner. I mean, it's a well-established ask for us in terms of the visas for touring artists and the current situation. At the moment, you can only have that, I think it's a certain number of days travel within 180 days. How precisely the EU were to find a solution for that is a matter for negotiation. I mean, our ask is pretty clear. We want that freedom for... And by the way, it's not just about UK touring artists touring the EU, and the numbers have gone down significantly in recent years. Also, of course, welcoming fine European artists here as well. What I would say, though, in terms of your point about things moving, up the pillars at different speeds, for example, on the security pillar, we've already agreed, for example, 6 monthly foreign policy dialogues between the High Representative and the Foreign Secretary. So you can see on the safety pillar, we've already increased our National Crime Agency presence at Europol. So you can already see the progress moving at slightly different speeds. But In terms of the detailed work that is going on, I'm satisfied with that. I think we've been extremely well served since we came into government. But also, remember as well the machinery of government change that's happened. So we do have the officials, as I described in an earlier answer, now in the Cabinet Office. And I think that change, I'm very lucky to be served by those officials at the centre of government. I think it should indicate a sense of priority, that unit is at the centre of government. So we've made the machinery of government change. You're entirely right to highlight the work in departments about proposals, but I think it's also hugely important as well that we've built those linkages and personal relationships to take this forward.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good morning, Minister. So the European Commission publishes the EU's opening position for negotiations with partners like the UK. It has done on youth mobility, for example. Is the government intending to do anything similar?
So I don't think they've published a final negotiating position yet. I mean, there's been various documents internally that have been going round. They've consulted member states on various things, but I think we'll need to see where we get to in terms of what I call the steep part of the negotiation. I'm not intending to publish between now and May some sort of detailed policy paper because, as I said in an earlier answer, I think the manifesto is the democratic mandate that we have for the negotiation. It contains both the framework, the red lines, and it also contains examples of what we are seeking to negotiate. And as I indicated a moment or two ago, we will be held to account on that manifesto. So I think that is what is setting out the structure, the guide to what we are seeking to do.
Sure. Do you think it's likely to lead to a better outcome if we do it that way, rather than being a bit more transparent and open about the way things may have moved since that time?
Well, I think there's two things there. I think, firstly, it is very important that I continue to update Parliament and am held to account, as I unquestionably will be. And indeed, I welcome Parliament's scrutiny, and I will continue to do that. I think it's a very important part of what I do. Secondly, in terms of the conduct of the negotiations, I think it is huge. It's just hugely important in terms of the approach that both sides act in good faith. We're obviously not going to always agree with that. That is just evidently the case in any negotiation. But what I will always be is a good faith partner who is negotiating in the UK's national interest.
Anything else, Sam? Thank you. I think we're back to Luke.
Thank you very much. So we've discussed being held to account, which I think we're all big fans of.
I gathered.
So obviously the negotiations that are going to be held, massive significance. Will you commit to providing the House a vote to approve the outcome of those negotiations?
So I'm not at the moment. Obviously, I don't know what legal form the ultimate position we reach is going to take. It's also the case that we are going to have a series of summits going forward. So I'm just going to, in relation to that, all I would say at this stage is that I am certainly committed to accountability and accountability to Parliament, accountability both during the process and indeed after it. But I would also just say that there are going to be a series of summits, not simply one, in terms of there being a sort of distinct point, which I think is what you're describing. I mean, again, Chair, I think back to the many votes of that 2017 to 19 Parliament without a great deal of fondness.
We're at one on that. Exactly. Luke, anything?
Well, yeah. So I'm just going to try and nail you down a little bit on this. I apologise, but in terms of, and you referenced the incredibly impactful negotiations that were occurring between 17 and 19. I think it was agreed at that point that the level of impact of those agreements was such that having votes on them from the Parliament that is elected to represent the country was appropriate. As these negotiations move forward, if there are points where there are major steps being taken, do you think that it is appropriate that there is a vote at those points.
Look, I'll obviously keep that under review. Obviously, going forward, we will have to see the final, the particular form that we get to. I mean, there are already certain parliamentary processes that, exist for certain types of international agreement. The CRAG process exists, for example, for particular types of agreement. So that there are already processes there if the agreement takes a particular form. So obviously I will continue to look at it. But the priority for me over the next few months is to obviously conduct the negotiation, but please be assured, and I hope you all take my presence here as my goodwill towards coming and being questioned on these matters.
Just before we leave Europe and go to the House of Lords, not literally, just going back, Paymaster, to your answer to my first question on the crime, migration type issues. Do you see a path, or if there is a path, a benefit for the UK to rejoin Dublin 4?
I think at the moment that isn't part of our plans at the moment. But I think in terms generally, let's just take the migration issue for a moment, Chair, which you quite rightly are highlighting. This is an issue that is facing countries around Europe. The problem of irregular migration. There's a problem in terms of the Mediterranean. There is an issue with smuggler routes, different routes, some coming through the Balkans, others coming through more Central Europe. So what we do look at this on the basis of is a pragmatic approach, a recognition that the boats we see in the English Channel, we all want to see that to be reduced. We all want to see people not risking their lives in the Channel. But we recognise that that problem is a continent-wide one, and it is by coordination that we think we can be most effective.
Just before we do go to Lord's reform, can I just pick up another part of your brief, which is, of course, public inquiries?
Yes.
Now, I think we understand that the review of the framework for inquiries is due next month, as I understand it, or as we understand it. Are you able to advise on the progress of that, and in broad terms what the review is considering, and how the House will be updated on any proposed changes?
I'll come in a moment, because I actually published yesterday, Chair, the government's response to the House of Lords Statutory Inquiries Committee report on public inquiries. But I wonder if it just might just help for a moment if I ask Darren to set at the work of the public inquiries response unit, and then I will come specifically
I
to
don't
your
think
point.
we've seen that response yet, but we certainly will do it. Mr. Tierney.
Sure. So the team that Minister mentions does three things. So we provide advice to the Minister on reform policy. We also provide advice to individual ministers on the setting up and design of specific inquiries. The second thing it does is it acts as a kind of hub for best practice and information on how to run inquiries, and that's a resource really for sponsor teams and secretaries to inquiries. And then the third thing we do is we actually then sponsor individual inquiries, particularly those where the PM is the lead minister. So recently that's been the Grenfell inquiry, infected blood inquiry, and the COVID inquiry. So those are the three main focuses of the team. But it's the reform element that I think you're asking about that we will be advising ministers on shortly.
And just to come to that, Chair, because I think that's the nub of the question. Look, I think recent years and these recent decisions have continued to show the value of the public inquiry, both in our political life and indeed in the administrative justice system. They are they're regarded as independent, legitimate, trusted. I think the statutory public inquiry has that particular position in our politics. I think they also serve a number of functions. They shed light on what happened in the past. They are often providing a means for victims and survivors to have their voices heard. And they can also be part of both rebuilding trust and learning lessons. So I think there's no question about our recognition of the value.
Yes.
However, I also think it's the case that we are starting to see issues arising in terms of duration, issues arising in terms of cost, and some issues in terms of effectiveness, in terms of how we monitor, for example, government responses to recommendations from public inquiries. And in terms of the response I published yesterday, I mean, the committee found, and I quote, the 2005 Act, in other words, the Inquiries Act of 2005, and the wider governance structure of public inquiries must be improved. And, I've accepted that recommendation. There are then, I won't go through them all, Chair. I'm sure the committee you'll be able to read the government's published response. But there are a number of recommendations here that, the government has accepted. For example, ministers should, where appropriate, consult victims and survivors on the overall terms of reference. We've accepted that. When establishing an inquiry, the sponsoring minister should consider including an indicative deadline in terms of the terms of reference, keeping in mind the particular purpose of the inquiry, which I've also accepted. Another recommendation as well about interim reports, which I think is very important, because one of the problems is if you have an inquiry that's making recommendations about considering changes in government policy. Now, it's always up to the government of the day whether to accept them, but if they are coming years and years down the line, the issue is they may well have been superseded by intervening events. So, for example, I think it is useful. Grenfell was obviously in 2 phases. The COVID inquiry has been held on a module basis. So I think, again, that is a very useful thing to be looking at. There's also a wider question here, by the way, and it is a role for Parliament, as to where Parliament stands and how Parliament chooses to hold whatever the government of the day is to account on government decisions on recommendations. And governments essentially can accept in full, they can accept partially, they can, as the democratically elected government of the day, not accept something. But what I think is important, there are 2 things. Number one, that there is a full explanation from the government as to why it's taken the position it has. But secondly, then, I think this is one of the aspects of the House of Lords committee looking at this was in terms of how Parliament sought to hold ministers to account. Is it that you have something, specialist committee within Parliament? Obviously, that is a matter for Parliament, but I think that parliamentary scrutiny is a really important point of the process too.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly take your point on timeliness and cost. And very often, by the time we're given the answers, we can barely remember what the question was, and the issue has either moved on or resolved itself in the time. I'm just going to take John on this, and then we're going to move to Lord's reform. John.
Thanks, Chairman. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion around a national inquiry into grooming gangs, and obviously the Home Secretary decided not to have the national inquiry, but to have an audit of some of the previous investigations. Could you outline for the committee what your role was in terms of discussions with the Home Secretary in terms of how she came to that decision?
Well, in terms of that decision, that is a matter for the Home Office and for the Home Secretary. It's obviously different when we are the sponsoring department. So, for example, the one that is not only I am directly responsible for is around infected blood, for example, where is very much part of my responsibilities. So that obviously was a decision for the Home Secretary. The Home Secretary back on January the 16th launched a national 3-month audit that's going to be led by Dame Louise Casey. The audit looks at further evidence, including ethnicity data, demographics of gangs involved and their victims, including cultural and societal drivers for this type of offending. And the Home Secretary made a statement to Parliament that day. Dame Louise Casey is a very respected public servant. I'm sure will conduct this with the professionalism and thoroughness that she brings to these tasks, and it's a 3-month audit, so I imagine it will fulfil that.
Forgive me, but you are the Minister responsible for Public Inquiries Policy and also the Public Inquiry Response Unit. Was there no discussion between the Home Office and your own team regarding this announcement?
That was a matter for that decision was a matter for the Home Secretary.
That wasn't my question. Was there no discussion between you and the Home in terms of engagement with the Home Office?
So the only requirement is that in the ministerial code makes it clear that individual ministers must consult the Prime Minister before inquiries are set up and agreed. So that happened in this case. So there was discussion between the Home Office and Number 10. There isn't a kind of lock, as it were, between the Cabinet Office and individual Secretaries of State, but the ministerial code is clear that there is with the Prime Minister.
It wasn't discussed. Okay, thank you.
It seemed to me that there may be merit in the Cabinet Office holding the ring on that as a point of reference to ensure some degree of uniformity in decision taking and remit setting and the like.
Look, I think in terms of...
That wishing to add to your work schedule.
In terms of what we are now looking at around in this area, in terms of how we make it more effective, I think what it was certainly correct to say is, and I think please do consider the response I published yesterday, because I think there are a number of things in there you will find, I'm sure, interesting and will want to comment on, I'm sure. But obviously, in terms of looking at different factors, like, for example, the voice of victims and survivors in terms of reference being consistent across the piece, I think this is something we look at going forward.
Right, we've got about 23 minutes, I think. We're going to do a quick canter through the historical organisation, namely the House of Peers, and we're going to kick off with Lauren.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, the government has made some manifesto commitments in respect of House of Lords reform, and some of my colleagues will pick up on the specifics of that. But we're interested in your views about the strengths and weaknesses of the current House of Lords.
I think that's a very good opening question, and I do approach this on the basis of strengths and weaknesses, because I think there are significant strengths that the upper house does bring to our democracy, both in terms of a more considered form of scrutiny and indeed a level of expertise, often very specific expertise. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that we members of Parliament do not have a range of expertise to offer, but there is, I think, there is a particular specialist expertise that an appointed house can bring. Now, in terms of the weaknesses point, I think that it is democratically illegitimate to have people in the House of Lords who are there by virtue of the family into which they're born, and that is why the manifesto commitment that we were elected on said the next Labour government will therefore bring about an immediate modernisation by introducing legislation to remove the right of hereditary peers to sit and vote in the House of Lords, and that's precisely the piece of legislation that's originally been brought forward. I think it will be considered presently in committee in the upper house. So I think that initial first step does deal with that, in my view, illegitimate situation. Now there are then a series of other points around the manifesto around things like participation requirements. And I used the term participation very specifically because it isn't just about a level of attendance, because there are some members of the Lords who might not speak in dozens and dozens of debates, but when they do speak with their particular expertise, they add something to our democracy, which is why I've put participation. But broadly speaking, if you look at what I call the second stage of Lords reform, which is published in the manifesto, from retirement age, strengthening the circumstances in which disgraced members can be removed, looking at the appointments process, national regional balance, they are about trying to make the Lords more representative of the nations and regions, but they are also trying to deal with the issue of the overall size of the House as well. I would hope that that second stage we can look at it on a much more consensual basis, because I'm not somebody who wants to take away the things that I think are very good about the House of Lords. Far from it. I want to try and build upon the strengths of the House of Lords as we take the reform process forward.
Thank you. Do you have any idea, or are you able to tell us when you may be intending to reach that second phase?
Well, it The bill, the first step, first of all, which is the Hereditary Peers Bill, we obviously want to get onto the statute book in this parliamentary session. Then, of course, we will turn to how we take this second stage forward. But the manifesto was very clear that there would be an immediate modernisation in terms of that bill.
Do you expect that the government will be able to implement all of the manifesto commitments in this area during its term?
I think that depends upon the progress we can make in the upper house, I think. Not entirely within my control.
Thank you. And just a final one from me. What, in your view, what should the role of the Lords be?
I think what the Lords brings to our democracy is that more considered form of scrutiny, that ability to ask the House of Commons to think again. And, you know, the Parliament Act of 1911, I think it says a great deal about reform of this area that was originally thought to be temporary. And its essential framework is still temporary over a century later. But what that allows, you know, there's a distinction obviously between finance bills and indeed ordinary bills. The Parliament Act and the 1949 Act reduced the period of delay that the House of Lords has. But I think that ability of the House of Lords to ask Parliament to think again, but also to bring that specialist, more considered scrutiny, I think is hugely important.
Thank you, Minister.
Why the timidity on this? You've got the most enormous parliamentary majority. Reform of the Lords has been at the forefront of the minds of the Labour Party since Keir Hardie was in small trousers. You have the manifesto commitment so the Lords couldn't frustrate it. The removal of the remaining 92 is effectively just a mopping up exercise from the Blair Act. These are not the bright sunlit uplands, are they, of constitutional reform, which many thought a dynamic Labour government would usher in. This is your century-awaited opportunity, 14 years of opposition to work out how the Lords could look to fulfil those functions that you have rightly set out. It is a bit all underwhelming, isn't it? And I say that as a Conservative.
Well, I'm the conversion to radical reform is much appreciated, Chair. But in terms of this, the lesson I draw on this is you've had previous Labour governments with very large majorities that have sought what I would describe as a big bang reform of the Lords and have ended up with nothing. I mean, a very good example of that is in the late 1960s. You had a government that had been elected in March 1960, been re-elected in March 1966 with a majority of just under 100. They tried to do, and in those days, of course, there was a far larger number of hereditaries at that time.
Yeah, because the Life Peerages Act had only been
1958 to the Life Peerages Act, yes. So it was still a huge percentage hereditary. Tried a big bang reform and got absolutely nothing from it. And the conclusion, therefore, that I drew on this is that in order to actually deliver reform, it needed to be done step by step. You know, history was telling me that where you'd attempted to do this radical reform, it just hadn't worked and you'd ended up with nothing. Hence why there is the step-by-step approach in the manifesto. I would also, though, suggest, Chair, that I am somebody who sees significant value in the work of the upper house, and where there is that significant value, I am somebody who wants to see that thrive and have public support going forward.
Yes, I appreciate the step-by-step approach, but it's the speed of the steps. I mean, these are very ponderous, even-footed steps.
Chair, if their lordships were to usher the Hereditaries Bill through more quickly, we could all move more quickly.
The Lords, like the Lord, perform their things, their wonders to perform, and all the rest of it. Michelle.
Thank you. Some of which has already been answered already, but just to say that I do welcome forward the fact that the bill is going forward with regards to the commitment with regards to hereditary peers. But I suppose just to focus on one element of that, you've talked about the mandatory requirement age and a new participation requirement. And I'm looking at when you're going to move forward with regards to strengthening the circumstances where disgraced peers can be removed. I think that's something that both myself and actually the public are quite keen to find out.
Yeah, and look, in terms of there's a couple of points there. I think firstly, the size. I think most people are agreed that the overall size is too big. So it's looking at methods, fair methods, to try to reduce the size. The second point, as I indicated in a previous answer, I do think participation is a distinct point from attendance. And I think where there are members of the upper house who bring a deep specialism in a certain area, that they shouldn't be penalised for the fact that they may only be contributing to one type of debate, but they do bring significant expertise to it, which is why the word participation was used. Secondly, the House of Lords also has, its own rules in terms of how it governs itself. But I think a discussion around the circumstances in which disgraced peers are removed is something that was being demanded by the public in the last Parliament. I don't tread into issues of how the House of Lords self-regulates, but my sense is there's a general recognition that is something we do need to look at.
Yeah, and maybe a point but a question at the same time. We've talked about the speed of which it is going. I'm more of the actually this is an essential part of our democratic and how we work as a country. And it's kind of, would you agree that actually sometimes it's good to get this right and move really, really fast on it? And actually, the government is committed to making those changes with the Lords, which is great, but actually taking that time to make sure that we get it absolutely right. I've had the privilege of actually working in the Lords for the Lords, and I've seen firsthand some of that exceptional expertise that is actually in the Lords as well. But it would be interesting to see where your point of where actually we need to actually really get this right as well.
You're absolutely, and it is that balance between moving as quickly as we can on delivery, but getting it right. And I should say, just for the record, Chair, as well, around it is nothing personal with the 92 hereditary peers, a number of whom have made very significant contributions. It's a matter of principle. It's nothing to do with the individuals. And whether it's in relation to the hereditaries or indeed, life peers, other peers in the House of Lords, I very much recognise the contribution they make, and you will have seen the contribution having worked there. It's not a question of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, not at all. It's trying to value what is good and enhance it.
Given that, there must surely be some merit in commuting a hereditary peerage to a sort of supernumerary list of life peers at the point when they are extinguished, for those who have that, as Michelle has referenced, sort of, expertise, active contribution, bring something to the debates which other peers can't, rather than, use your phrase, throw the baby out with the bathwater, out with the normal party leader's nomination for peerages process.
Well, in terms of... look, there's no barrier on hereditary peer becoming a life peer. There certainly isn't a barrier. In terms of numbers, obviously the crossbenchers are in a slightly different position because they wouldn't come under the party leaders' lists, obviously. And I know you're making the point about, Chair, about something additional, but I would observe that, of course, throughout the course of this Parliament, you will have the ordinary process of Prime Minister, Leader of the Opposition, party leaders will, as always happens in Parliament, have their lists, and it's a matter for the party leaders who they wish to nominate. But there's no barrier to hereditary peer being nominated.
You'll be aware that opposition leaders, whether it's the leader of the Liberal Democrats or the leader of the Conservative Party or whatever, has a cap on the number of nominees that they have. It's not a cap which the Prime Minister has.
Well, look, that's just a description of the arrangements that we've had for decades, isn't it? That the Prime Minister... And, there are... there have been usual channel discussions in the past where certain leaders of the opposition have nominated a certain number. That's just how this process has worked. But my overall point, Chair, is that there's no barrier to hereditary peers being considered alongside others in the normal way.
There's no barrier either in the government recognising the expertise and specialism, which you've agreed with Ms Welsh about, with the government saying as part of the legislation, those who are deemed to be specialists, experts, unique contributors, call it what you will, would have their hereditary titles transferred to a life peerage under the Act.
You're asking me to stray into new territory there, Chair, but I would say first...
Not new territory, because I raised it in...
No, you've raised it to me in the Chamber,
yes.
But new territory in terms of the committee today. All I would say on this is that, firstly, our priority is to get that Act onto the statute book. That is the priority for this session. It's the first step. I would argue it's within the Salisbury Convention, because it's in the manifesto.
Yes.
Clearly as a first step. With regard to the wider point you're making, I would simply return to my earlier point. There is no barrier to hereditary peer receiving a life peerage and being nominated.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just not to labour this point, just to come in on that specifically, would you agree with me, Minister, when we're looking at this in the whole, that actually to add in a process to convert existing hereditary peers into life peers almost kicks the can down the road and extends the issue further than it needs to be? And further, is there also a point that to kind of give hereditary peers almost an extra privilege of an almost extra opportunity for a life peerage compared to anyone else would actually still sort of be giving a hereditary advantage?
I think what that points to is the importance of the principle of getting this bill onto the statute book, that it isn't personal. I know a number of the hereditary peers myself, I'm sure, Chair, you do too. It's not a personal thing, but it is about that principle of places in our legislature being reserved for people by accident of birth. And I think you're entirely right to say that is a fundamental principle the bill is seeking to address.
Thank you very much. So talking about disgraced peers and the size of the chamber brings us neatly on to the Bishop's Bench, I think. We spoke in the chamber, I spoke in the chamber about the importance of examining the presence of the Bishop's Bench in the House of Lords. You spoke about the sequential nature of reform, which I think, again, we've revisited here. I think we are all very supportive of. And the second stage of reforms as well has been mentioned. Will reviewing the presence of bishops in the Lords be part of that second stage?
I'm not making proposals around disestablishment of the church, or indeed...
Well, that's a separate point.
Or the position, you are right, they are separate, or the position of the bishops. That said, do I think that having a diversity of faiths, and indeed those of no faith, represented in the upper house generally in appointments, I do think that's a very important principle that, of course, we should look at in the nomination process to the upper house. I think the matters for stage 2 are the matters that are in the manifesto, and they are what we will seek to take forward. But today it is fundamentally about this first bill getting onto the statute book.
Right, we've got 6 minutes, 2 more questions. I'm determined that we cover it off. I'm going to look to Marcus Campbell-Sabers.
I'll be brief, Chair. In setting out is setting out the reasons for appointments sufficient to ensure the quality of appointments?
I really hope it's helpful. And one of the, I laid a written ministerial statement in recent months on having about 150-word citation for each appointment, because it always struck me as puzzling that in our honours system, if you have someone who is awarded, say, OBE, CBE, MBE, there's always a citation for why that's happened for services to whatever it might be. It always struck me as a real anomaly that we were publishing these lists of people without really any explanation. So I think that reform that I introduced, I think it was just before Christmas, that I hope will give some more transparency as to why people have been appointed, but also a sense of the qualities they will bring to our upper chamber.
That maybe deals with the perception of the public, understanding why people have been appointed, but in terms of us ensuring that that is actually a quality appointment, is there more work that needs to be done there?
Well, you're entirely right to identify that, and the Prime Minister has been very clear that people who are appointed to the House of Lords, it shouldn't be seen purely as an honour. What it should be seen as is going to do a job of work in our legislature. And you are entirely right to highlight quality is hugely important, but also variety of experience that's been brought to the upper chamber to give voices to different aspects of our society, different experiences, I think is really important in the Lords too.
I mean, recognising that quality is so important in what is going to be a job for life, why is the House of Lords Appointment Committee not able to check the suitability and propriety of candidates?
Well, they do make the Prime Minister, they do make an assessment. I think.
You tell us more.
Do you want to just give the detail on that?
So they make the assessment on probity and propriety for all candidates, including political nominations. They assess suitability for their own crossbench nominations. They don't assess suitability for political nominations.
Should they?
Well, look, I actually think on this it's the probity and integrity bit that's the fundamental bit going forward. And I think that is hugely important, because what it is about is giving confidence from the public. I mean, the issue of, if you take it into the sort of suitability territory, the problem is what suitability actually means is what becomes a really contested concept. I think it is what I think it's on probity and integrity that's, I think, fundamental.
There's one of the words that's not been really kind of used in here is this democracy element, and which is obviously quite a key element in the conversation that's had in the public around this issue. I mean, that suitability being in the hands of those making those political appointments, shouldn't we be questioning whether it's right that the patronage should still sit with the Prime Minister on these issues?
Well, I think that the Prime Minister is obviously hasn't been a member of the House of Lords since go back to Lord Salisbury. So the Prime Minister is an elected member of Parliament who has a particular democratic mandate as the head of the government. So I think that's where the legitimacy comes from. I mean, you can have a debate, and I've had many of these debates in the past about how you wish to.
I've had a few myself.
I'm sure you have many over the years. But I think what an appointments process gives you is the ability to have particular expertise in the laws. I think would be far harder to get in the an elected house. So I do think there is merit in it.
Richard.
Very quickly, just to follow up on that point in terms of the nature of the House, one of the things that was brought up in the excellent report by the Commission on the UK's Future was the fact that the House of Lords currently is not reflective of our nations and regions, and we could be making far more efforts to ensure that it was. I mean, isn't it important to reflect on that report and its detailed recommendations, and isn't that a key element of that report in terms of highlighting a current deficit within our second chamber?
I absolutely think a chamber reflective of the nations and regions is hugely important right across the United Kingdom, and I think in having the appointments process and that at the forefront of the mind in terms of making nominations is hugely important, because it is an upper house for the whole of the United Kingdom, and it's just important to reflect that.
You've got time for a final question.
Why not?
Sorry?
Why not?
You're generous. Charlotte, and I will say quickly.
Thank you. Your manifesto committed to replacing the House of Lords with an alternative second chamber and consulting on proposals. What's your timetable for that consultation, and how will you ensure that the public are inputting into it?
Well, in terms of timetable, we will look to get this bill, the Hereditaries Bill, onto the statute book in this session of Parliament. What we would then like to do in terms of the next stage of reform is really to try and move to a position of consensus where we're moving forward. How precisely then we would look to involve the public and on what timetable would be a matter for those discussions. But how quickly we can get to the second stage depends on how quickly we can get this bill onto the statute book. And on that note, Chair, I hope it will be done quickly.
Thank you very much indeed. And Ms Gough, our apologies for wasting your time this morning. You've been phenomenally patient, but you have a very well briefed minister, which is always an encouraging thing. Paymaster, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.
Darren,
thank you all very much. Thank you, Chair.
Order.